than there was earlier. I think that's very important. George has made a huge contribution to it. Things like CNN made a huge contribution. Ted Turner told me one of the first things he did when the CNN came up was to say that no newscaster should refer to foreigners because there didn't exist a foreigner, members from other countries. Now there's a kind of vision there which is really important. On the subject, I was very amused by suing God, but I'm not opposed to it. I was reminded a little of that often quoted 16th century epitaph of a chap who died in the church, who was buried in a churchyard, and the epitaph asked God for something, and the epitaph just consists of saying, "Here lies Martin Engelbrod. Have mercy on his soul, Lord God, as I would if I were Lord God, and if you were Martin Engelbrod."
Yes. Try it again, see if it goes out now.
I think you have to get it worked, though.
Oh,
There you go.
yes.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for your stimulating talk on justice,
Thank
a
you.
topic which is much needed these days. But I was surprised that in your discussion on justice, you didn't talk about power at all. And in particular, in the controversy between comparative and transcendental understandings of justice. Of course, there is the issue of power, and there's a power struggle between these two understandings of justice and how to implement them. So I was wondering how you would respond to the issue of power in the role of justice.
I could not have been very articulate because my second point was all about the responsibility of power. That's what it was called.
Well, I'm afraid it was not that persuasive because...
No, but that's a different argument from mine. Not to talk about.
Well, may I
What
present
you
that
have to
argument?
explain to me not is why didn't I talk about power, but to say why I was so unpersuasive in that presentation.
Alas, you forced me to be honest.
But,
Yes, unfortunately, to cite responsibility is not enough when discussing power because that is always the road towards authoritarianism, is it not? And we have known lots of philosophies, traditions, and governments that have taken that line of talking about responsibility as a guise for power. And how do we deal with that then?
no, I think when you're talking about responsibility, which is what ethics is a lot concerned with, then whether power itself generates a responsibility without your having to justify it in terms of some as if social contract is, I think, a statement about what would be reasonable and what is not reasonable in that context. You're concerned that quite often what people see as reasonable they may not do, or they may not even agree that it's reasonable, which is a different thing. Power becomes very important when you're analyzing what's happening in the society. It's not, the topic of my talk was the idea of justice. And since I've always identifying capability as a kind of power, to the extent that capability is a central feature of any theory of justice that I think should have claim to our attention, power is inescapably involved in that. So I'm not quite certain. I encountered this often, partly because if you don't use the power 65 times, people immediately said you're not talking about power. There's a whole school of thought saying that somehow you're trying to avoid something. I can unmask you now. You're trying to avoid the asymmetry of power that exists in the world. I don't think there's anything to unmask. Asymmetry of power is exactly what this is about.
Yes.
I'd like to thank you, first of all, for your comments this evening, but I was left with a question. Human rights standards are often considered to be absolute justice standards against which...
What is?
Human rights are often considered to be absolute justice standards against which we compare situations. And this week I've definitely felt the tension between the MDGs and human rights. And given given this, I am wondering if human rights standards could be considered a form of transcendental justice, and if so, how does that fit into your theory of justice?
Yeah. Two things here. One is a comment which I would request everyone to follow. Could you tell us who you are?
Sure. My name is Lisa LaPlante, and this week I'm actually starting at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton.
Thank you. I think the distinction isn't quite like that between transcendental and comparative. That is, if human rights are important, more fulfillment of human rights is a comparative advance. You don't have to discuss first what is a transcendental society where every human right of everybody has been fully honored and realized. Now, we may not even agree what this full list of human rights are, and I think that's a hopeless point to start. So I think human rights, I'm delighted you raised that, is a good way of illustrating my point. If the human rights literature got bogged down in asking what is a transcendental, or what is, they wouldn't use that language, it's like transcendental is what we use when we're describing it in a way that they don't see it, because that doesn't sound an awfully attractive term. It's a term like being called, you don't describe yourself as a warg or a frog or a warp or whatever English eccentricities of abuse for foreigners is there. You don't say that as a warg I've just arrived here. Well, I guess I do say that. But it's a description of others. But if the people who would be in effect transcendentalists would not, in this case, I think, feel very comfortable by dealing with human rights by saying, what is the full list of human rights? And when all these are satisfied and there are nothing else left, it has to be only human rights and all human rights. When they're all fulfilled, then the world is transcendental. And you can't begin to talk about Amnesty International must not start agitating about anything. Human Rights Watch mustn't do anything until you've identified the transcendentally best human rights fulfillment. They don't begin like that, and there's a reason for that. And I think it's to the tribute of the human rights movement that they begin with a comparative question, as Mahbub did.
If I could just comment on this, because you raise a really, really interesting question, because there's human rights movement is attacked in Asia, but that these are not don't apply there. I mean, this is where the universality comes in. So the human rights as a concept is a universal concept, but it's not an absolute, not transcendental, and it has nothing to do with perfection. And very different standards of human rights prevail. And then the struggle is to try to improve them, not necessarily to reach perfection. So it's the difference between universal, yes, perfect, no.
But is it that because perfect is not attainable, but they always remain an aspiration, something that we're moving towards?
They may not be definable. We may have disagreement on this. There are all kinds of issues on which, the human rights questions. Is the right of a wife to be heard in public discussion, in family discussion, is that a human right? Is it? It's certainly very important. Do you want to treat it as a human right, and actually is a husband to be somehow chastised or perhaps even arrested if he's not consulting his wife? There are a whole lot of issues on which we may not quite agree whether it is a human right or not, but that doesn't stop Mary Wollstonecraft and Tom Paine to go ahead. And sometimes people underestimate the effect of it. One of the great things about Garrett Stedman Jones's new book on the history of poverty, really, in the world, it was the huge part that this I didn't know, came to my as a surprise, that Tom Paine's ideas written in 1790 had in the thinking about it across the world. It really is a revelation how these could be affected. And I'm also trying to say the same is true of Mary Wollstonecraft. In fact, since I've been quite involved with the feminist movement, it's a pity that it took a long time for the feminist movement to recognize how powerful Mary Wilson's line of reasoning